leaders and practitioners in the field. These women around me are helping pioneer solutions and elevate the voices of those who are often silenced. And with that, before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly explain how our afternoon will run. Each panelist has been asked to speak for 12 minutes and is going to give essentially an oral op-ed. And then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. And now I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Kathleen Newland. Ms. Newland is a senior fellow and co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute. She is chair emerita of the Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children and the founding director of the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, amongst many other things. Without further ado.
Thank you very much, Nikki. It's such a pleasure to be here. I really thank Professor Williams and the EPIIC course for inviting me. I've really enjoyed listening so far, and I enjoy talking too, so here's my chance. And indeed, happy International Women's Day, and I say that not just to the women in the room, but to the men as well, and to people of other genders, because progress for women benefits all of us. So the subject for this panel is gender and migration, and I want to make 4 points about that. The first point is that gender and migration is not just about women, although discussions about the gender dimensions of migration often devolve very quickly into discussions about women migrants. And there's some good reasons for this. In many settings, women migrants are more in need of protection than men. You've heard about some of those situations in the previous panel, where the majority, though by no means all, victims of trafficking are women. But it's by no means always the case that the majority are women. In the horrific detention centers in Libya, for example, the majority of the people held are men. One of my first visits to a refugee situation was the Dadaab camp in the north of Kenya, holding mostly Somali refugees. And there was, at the beginning of that, before they got the fuel situation organized, women were going out into the surrounding area to try to scrounge for firewood necessary to cook their meals. And there was an astonishingly high incidence of sexual assault of women going out to get firewood. And at one point I asked naively, well, you know, why are you doing this? Why don't the men go out and get firewood if you're so in danger of being raped? And they said, well, the men would get killed. We only get raped. And so there are different sort of perceptions and kinds of vulnerability. And I think when we think about gender, we need to keep that in mind. Boys are particularly, though not exclusively, vulnerable to forced recruitment into militias, extremist groups, drug cartels. And trans people and others of unconventional gender identities are probably the most vulnerable migrants of all. Non-conforming gender identity is an important reason why people leave their countries, particularly those countries particularly prevalent in Eastern Europe and in Africa, where there's a strong anti-gay bias. And it's a recognized ground for seeking asylum in many settings. So I'm going to talk in my remarks here mostly about sort of conventional gender identities, but I'll be happy to take questions about others as well. So what's the implication of this? I think the fact is that in many situations, women and men have different migration experiences. And women's migration experiences have often been invisible. Policymakers need to be scrupulous and certain that men and women and people of other genders are equally visible and are able equally to benefit from the protections and from the assistance provided. Now, for this to happen, we need good quality data, and we need good quality, timely data disaggregated by sex. Now, I know that sex is biological and gender is a socially constructed category, but for data, disaggregation by sex is probably about the best we can do. And it is extremely important. My second point is that awareness about the gender dimensions of migration is not just about vulnerability. Women migrants are more likely than men to be portrayed as victims. But it's important to keep in mind that men and women who migrate are agents of change in their own lives, for their families, and their communities. But there are differences in behavior and in impact. Studies have shown, for example, that remittances sent by women are more likely to be spent on children's education and healthcare and basic needs. So it's important not to paint women only as victims, but to focus, in addition to protecting them, on empowering them and in helping them to play the roles that come naturally. My third point, which is related to data, has to do with what Nikki mentioned, which is commonly called the feminization of migration. Are any of you familiar with that term? Feminization of migration? Okay, here we go. Well, this is a story implying that migration flows are becoming much more female, not feminine. I'm not even sure what that would mean in relation to migration, but more and more composed of women. It's presented as a great global trend. And this is seriously misleading because women have long made up nearly half of international migrants. When I first started working on women's issues, long before most of you were born, women made up about 47% of international migrants. This is in the 70s. Today, it's about 49%. This is not an earth-shaking shift. Now, it's true that more and more women are migrating, but so are more and more men. There are just more and more people migrating as a function of increased world population growth. The proportion of international migrants in relation to world population has been relatively stable for a long time. It's sort of creeped up by less than 1% over the last 40 years, from a little under 3% to a little over 3% of world population. That's the number of people the UN counts as being international migrants, which they define as people who have lived outside their country of birth for 1 year or more. There are various definitions of who's an international migrant, but that's probably the most widely accepted one. And very close to half of those international migrants are women. So the interesting question about gender ratios is not about the feminization of migration, but about the relatively recent visibility of women as migrants. Why did it take so long for it to sort of come to the sustained policy attention, and still not so sustained all the time, that that half of the people on the move are women? And if you look at women and dependent children, who are very often traveling with women, it comes much closer to 60, 70%, depending on the situation. If you look at women and dependent children together in almost any population, it comes to about 75%. So, these are sort of the basic demographics of the situation. And the reason, I think, there are many factors that go into bringing about the greater visibility of women as migrants. I think the just greater attention to women, to the changing role of women worldwide has finally brought about a realization that women are nearly half of all migrants. So my fourth point really is not a point, but a question, which is, what is different and significant from a policy perspective about the migration experience of women? And this is obviously a question that we could spend the rest of the day discussing. There are certainly differences associated with the reproductive role of women. There are differences associated with the broad cultural tendencies in many parts of the world, in many societies, to think of women as chattel, to think of women as property, to think of women as a way of to think of violence against women as a way of punishing not only women but men, the men associated with them, which does tend to result in greater victimization of women. And there is the tendency to treat women as commodities. And all of these tendencies result in greater vulnerability of women. But I think another big factor of the different experience in migration of women also has to do with the gender segmentation of the international labor market. Women tend to work in the least visible and least protected segments of the international labor market, and often the lowest paid. We've heard earlier today about women in domestic service in the Gulf. We've heard about women who've been trafficked. But the other segments in which women tend to be concentrated in the labor force, and particularly women migrants, are things in like personal care, child care, elder care, less skilled nursing occupations, as well as the garment industry and other sort of low-paid segments of the market. And the fact that women are concentrated in those segments of the labor market has contributed to their visibility, and their low pay has contributed to their lack of power. Those are the main points that I wanted to make in my oral op-ed, as Nikki put it. And I think that Astrid and Amia are now going to talk about what difference this makes and what kind of results we see from gender differences and gender dimensions in the real world.
Thank you so much, Ms. Newland. Our second panelist is Astrid Seibert. Ms. Seibert is a senior migration fellow with the Europe program based in the organization's Berlin office. She is a member of the advisory committee for the International Center on Policy Advocacy about Migration Narratives and frames and sits in the advisory committee on the German Foreign Office for the Global Forum on Migration and Development.
Well, thank you very much, Nikki, and thanks everyone for having me. Yes, today is International Women's Day, and Nikki invited us to think a bit differently about gender and migration, as you alluded to, not just to think about the victimization, so trafficking as we heard in the morning, but to also think a bit broader. I took her up on that offer and even went a step further. So I wanted to look into the role of women, and yes, footnote taken that gender is not just about women, but I will focus on that for now. So I wanted to look into the role as change agents as addressed by foreign policy and development policy. So it's a little bit of a broader lens. And so I wanted to look into how can foreign policy and development policy figure in a female component so that you don't necessarily have to move in the first place. This is what's generally called to address the root causes of migration, and how can those be mitigated by including and resorting to women. So slightly broader lens. Yes, today is also a Happy Women's Day, and originally I thought I had to take a vacation day. But in Berlin, for the first time in history, we all actually now get a day off. So for some, it's just a day off. For others, it's a day being here. But basically, and this is important, I think it's the Women's Day is to recognize women's achievements and to remind us as a society who we are, but also who we want to be, and to remind us that certain values have to be, that they did not always exist, but that we had to fight, or that they were fought for, and that we shall not forget that, because power is never given, you have to take it, no matter what group you are. So just a gentle reminder on International Women's Day for that. And it is a national holiday in more than 25 states, most of them in Africa and Asia, and as I mentioned, now also in Berlin. So, key insights from a policy angle. And here's going to be also a little question for you. So a fair and representation access to political decision-making for women is very crucial. We heard that they have different issues, they bring up different dynamics. And this is not to say that men cannot and have not been strong advocates for women's rights or for women. They have, and hopefully always will be. It needs alliances, so it needs everyone sitting in the room to think about that. And I will tell you later on why it's not only the right thing to do, but why it's also a smart and strategic thing to do. And so, question to you, where do you think in the world is the highest representation of women in a parliament? Just which country do you think? And just throw it out here. Iceland, I hear. Anything else? Aha, okay. I already have very smart people in the audience, yes. So I heard Sweden over here, Iceland, the Nordic countries, what one usually would assume. But yes, it is indeed Rwanda, which might be a surprise to some. So it's 61% of the Rwandan parliament are women. If you want to know where the US fares on that, it's on place 78. So you have about 20%. Same for Germany. We're also not so good. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we speak, that it's not just about countries of origin where we have to think about the female or women's issues and access to representation, but it's also in our countries and how that shapes some of the discussions we're having. Yes, oh, the US is actually place 78. So, but Sweden was mentioned. I now invite you to Sweden because I wanted to bring today on International Women's Day a slightly different perspective and talk about the Sweden, one of the most contentious governing strategies that they have had in the past years. And it's in 2014, it was the very first country in the world that publicly adopted, and now hold your breath, a feminist foreign policy. As you can imagine, that was really a big turmoil, even in a country like Sweden. Why do you call it a feminist foreign policy? Do you have to call it that way? But they were quite explicit about that, and they've also just also renewed it. They put the promotion of gender equality and women's rights at the center of this diplomatic agenda. And what is it? So basically it consists of 3 R's. So it's rights, representation, and resources. The rights, it's promotion of women's issues whenever they're working on the foreign policy dimension to keep the promotion of women's issues in mind, including by countering gender-based violence and discrimination. But they also, and Kathleen alluded to this, but it's also about reproductive rights and they started some called #SheDecides, so that women actually, wherever they are in the world, can have access to that and can also decide on their own about when they want to procreate. Representation, already alluded to that in the question, we need support including support for women's participation at all levels of decision making, but also from the private sector boards to the legal systems. And resources, the 3rd R, is to ensure equitable allocation among people of all genders. And here you name budgets from the government, but also development budgets, to always think in the gender dimension. So why is this strategic and not just the right thing to do? Well, there's a growing body of research at the Council on Foreign Relations, the UN, military publications, that the relationship between women's inclusion and stability in countries is actually quite pronounced. And whenever you have a stability in a country, that also you have less factors for women to leave, or in fact for everyone to leave. But this is why they're putting such a strong focus on this, to really focus on the stability. So one study, it's the 2015 study by the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. It showed when women participate in peace processes, the agreements are more likely to last and to be forged in the very first place. There's also a UN study that the probability that a peace agreement will last 15 years or longer increases by 35% if women are involved. So it's not just a right thing to do, it's also very strategic to do that and to think about ways and means to do that. And of course, sociologists can now come up with questions, why is that? And we can discuss that later. But I invite you to read the Reimagining Peace Processes and to think about it in a broader lens when we talk about gender and migration. And maybe some of you will offset this balance, but between 1992 and 2011, just 2% of chief mediators and 9% of negotiators in peace processes were women. It's a very low number. Of course, it makes sense because if it's about to end the violence, women are rarely the ones who have started it or are the belligerents, and hence they're not really necessarily seen as the main or legitimate participants to end or talk about ceasefires. But if the goal is to build peace, it makes sense to gain diverse inputs. And mediation teams and policymakers frequently voice concern how to facilitate women's participation in practice, not just on paper, but to also make sure that they're present in these negotiations and that they've also heard. As always, it's not necessarily about the quantity, it's about the quality, but it does make a difference if you have more women involved in these processes. Yes, so the feminist foreign policy is in more countries, and they are picking this up. 79 countries who have now national action plans to elevate the role of women in peace and security processes. Germany is also among one of them. We've now also been, we're now part of the Security Council, or sitting there, and actually the claim is women, security and peace. Next week in New York, there will also be a session on that. And 2 weeks ago in our parliament, we had a fierce debate on women or on a feminist foreign policy agenda as well. We had the same discussions and turmoil about this, and should we really call it that way? But it got the point across that it might be worthwhile to talk about this. What has also been on an institutional level, you see ambassadors at large for women's issues, recognizing the role that these women's issues in alleviating poverty and creating stability, in addressing some of the root causes for migration play. Slight footnote, it's been vacant, or it was vacant for 2 years in the US under Trump. I'll leave it to you what that means or why that is. But women empowerment is not just on the foreign policy agenda, it's also to guide foreign aid programs. And Canada actually launched the first feminist international assistance policy last year, and it's empowering women overseas and at home. And it makes families and countries more prosperous. And we can talk about that. And Kathleen already alluded to some of the topical areas on remittances, so the money that migrants send home, how women play a different role here, or actually send more, or send more often remittances home. And that, yes, it's more a focus on family and education, actually. At the core of this feminist, at the Canadian example of the feminist international assistance policy is to eradicate poverty and to support the sustainable development goals. And the goal overall is to contribute to building local capacity. That's really important if you want to have sustainable results. And the sustainable development goals, if you might heard of them or worked on them, and they have one aspect just on women, but they've also, it's a cross-cutting theme. Why? Again, people have realized, well, it's not just the right thing to do, it's quite strategic. Because to focus on that, it serves as they found in studies that it's really, that gender equality is an accelerator for achieving the sustainable development goals. So if you're ever found yourself in a position where you have to negotiate or figure out some of these goals or how to implement them, be sure to look and take a gender lens as well and a women's lens. Just one, and I know that the next panel after this will focus on climate change or climate and refugees. But I thought it was interesting from, and how this can also be a factor why people or why women also have to leave an area. And I thought it was interesting to hear that women as change agents also play a role in mitigation and adaptation. And this was really quite recognized also at the Paris Accord, where Sweden, with a foreign policy agenda, really kept pushing that point as well. And I'll leave you with one number, or one fact, that the higher number of, or percentage of women representatives you have in a country, and again, keep in mind which are the countries that have that, then the more likelihood you have of environmental treaties being ratified. It's not just the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. If that is a fact, if we can see that, heck, okay, then I'll make sure that I'll figure out how to involve more women. You also have a decreased level of deforestation. If you have more women in the represented. And this was a study, a 61-country study. So summing up, this is all, yes, Sweden started in 2014, Canada last year. So, and of course it's not new to look into women's issue, but it's really more pronounced these days, and also in the foreign policy community, in the security policy, to look into these issues. But the verdict is still out how these policies play out. Policies can only be one leverage, of course. You have to figure out how to coordinate with all the different actors. And of course also with migrants and migrant communities. And you also have to be self-critical. You can't just say, oh, our foreign policy is gender, we have a feminist foreign policy, and yet you don't look what's happening at home. And so, yeah, it's not just, and I'll close with that, but it's not just, I don't want to get you a false impression that it's about assuring to address root causes of migration. It's also important that migration itself, and when women migrate, it's a factor of development. So migration as development is really important, and they are seen as change agents. And I already mentioned the remittances, that you see different patterns, what they're spending the money on when they remit, but also those households that are female-led, how they're using it. You're seeing a change of social norms. When women migrate, not always is it as in the victimization, it's also a sense of empowerment. Social norms are changing. When they return, they're more likely to also start their own business. And then also if they're in the countries of, or host countries, or where they want to move to, they also have an important function to be bridge builders and to help other women situate. And we can talk about that. That's really been happening in Germany with refugee movements. And yeah, so, and last but not least, I'll leave you with the tidbit that I think it's also worthwhile for you guys to think about the role of tech and migration for women. There have been a lot of attempts and also approaches for coding classes and coding schools. Beauty is you can have it remotely, but you can also have it in the countries of origin and the countries where they're going to, and to really get women more equipped with skills that are needed to also participate in the labor market in the 21st century. And so these coding schools are really a neat way, and you don't necessarily have to have a high level of education to begin with, which is really important, because a lot of the women who are migrating are not necessarily having a high level of education. And yeah, I'll leave it to you guys to see what you can make out of that, but wanted to stress that it's not just about trying to hinder or to address the root causes, but that migration is also a factor of development for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have our third and final panelist, Alia Mata. Ms. Mata has been a coordinator with the International Organization for Migration in El Salvador for 10 years. She has a master's in regional integration and development, and also in local development.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to have me here, and thank you all for participating in this. Thank you for your time. And this really shows the interest that people is having in the migration theme. And as my colleagues said, that gender and migration is not only related to women. We always talk about women because they are maybe the most vulnerable group, but it's not only related to women. We have LGBTI population that also has to be focused in this migration. And And as they already said, why we talk about feminization of migration? Because it is not that lately women are more, it is the number increasing for women. We have almost the same number that years ago, but today, for example, they are more visualized in the migration process. But why, if they are more visualized in the migration process, they are not empowered? They're underrepresented always in this process of migration. As IOM, we recognize different stages of migration, for example, the country of origin, the country of transit, the country of destination, and the country of return, if they decide to return to the country. And in those all the stages, we need to take into account the gender theme. For example, women need to have different policies, as they already mentioned, that focus their needs, their specific needs. We made, as IOM, a diagnosis in all the region, Central American region, related to policies and programs developed for women. And we found that there are several documents and policies, laws, programs developed for women, but they don't include the theme of migration. For example, we have several laws to decrease the gender-based violence, but we don't include the migration topic in this. And as we were saying already in the domestic work, for example, I became a mom some months ago, and I feel very lucky because of the benefits I have in my job. For example, I have the maternity leave, and then a year after I have the breastfeeding time for my baby. But what about the people that is working in our houses sometimes that are migrants? Do they have the same rights that we have within a formal job? Do they have access to this time of rights? For example, the maternity leave, the breastfeeding time, do they have this access, the migrant women and the jobs they have? This is something that we have to put on top, for example, the rights of these women working in the domestic job. We have to formalize domestic job. For example, in the Central American region, most of the women migrate from Guatemala to Mexico or from Nicaragua to El Salvador to work in this sector. And none of these women are regularized. This means that they don't have access to health, they don't have access, neither their children, to study, so we have to formalize this sector. And I want to talk a little bit what is I am doing related to this. We have the MIGOV, that is the Migration Governance Framework Objectives, that force all the projects and programs that are developed by IOM to include gender topics. When we develop projects, we have to include in all our programs the gender issue. We also have the gender equality policy that tends to assist governments to develop programs focused on gender. And we also develop the regional guidelines to assist and protect migrant women. This is under the framework of the RSC. The RSC is the Regional Conference on Migration that includes 11 countries from Canada to Panama and also the Dominican Republic. And these regional guidelines looks to have a standardized process to assist and attend migrant women. We also have an e-campus. It's called, you can Google it, e-campus IOM. And it is to assist governments to strengthen their capacities to approach this women and gender migration theme. For example, we have courses related to human trafficking. We also have related to irregular migration, how to stop it. We also have MyGap. You can also look in your phones. For example, this is most addressed for migrants. This is really useful because they give migrants the information on the next consulate. For example, they also have a medical translator. If they, for example, don't speak Spanish or they don't speak English, it's developed in the three main languages of IOM, French, English, and Spanish. This medical translator is really useful because sometimes migrants, they don't want even to go to doctor because they don't, if they're in a foreign country, they don't know the language and they don't know how to express themselves if they are having some illness. So this medical translator assists them. They just type what they're feeling and they can translate to the doctor. So these are some tools that are developed to assist migrants and also the governments to strengthen their capacities to build some policies for migrant women. But as I mentioned, we are leaving behind the theme of LGBTI population that we need to enforce related to gender and migration.
I want to thank all of our panelists for their very thoughtful opening remarks. We'd now like to open the floor to questions from the audience, unless our panelists have questions for each other. Nope. And we ask that you line up behind it. Please introduce yourself before asking your question, and in the interest of taking as many questions as possible, please direct your question at one panelist, but all of you should feel free to answer and keep it to a minute or less.
Yeah, whoops, okay. Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class. So I'm not really sure who my question is directed towards. I'd love to hear your opinions on what I'm going to ask. But it pertains to the concept of refugees and how, so in this year's class, we've read a lot of arguments about specifically pertaining to women as refugees and how the definition of refugee is quite limiting in that, for example, the primary example we've talked about is domestic abuse. So that's not included in the definition of a refugee. In the Central American example, for example, there's a lot of women that migrate from Central America to the United States to escape domestic abuse, not included in the definition of a refugee. But in this year's class, we've heard arguments on one side who say that the definition of a refugee should be restrictive. It needs to be restrictive because there's a certain limited amount of spots for refugees and they receive very specific protections under that status, so it should be limiting. And then we've heard arguments on the other side that say that, I mean, this is an obvious flaw in the system, right? Like what's the difference between somebody that needs domestic abuse protection and somebody that's fleeing their country for any other reason where they fear for their lives? So I'm curious to hear your opinions on where you stand on this topic and if you think that there's maybe other ways than classifying women fleeing domestic abuse as refugees, like maybe there's other ways to help than classifying them as such. Curious to hear your opinions.
I'll be happy to start in on that one. You know, the key, there's, as I'm sure you know, there's several sort of key elements of the refugee definition. One, that people have to be outside their own countries, and that they have a fear of persecution on one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. And that last one, membership of a particular social group, is key for women suffering from domestic abuse. But I think another central element of the refugee definition is also extremely relevant for these women, and that is that refugees are people who cannot count on the protection of their own governments. And there have been a number of court cases, some successful, some not, that have argued that women victims of domestic abuse are members of a particular social group. That has tended to be more narrowly defined, like they are members of the social group composed of wives of police or military who are close to the government, and therefore the government won't intervene on their behalf. There's been some success in litigating on that basis, but particular social group is a deliberately ill-defined and potentially expansive category for protection, and it has been used both inclusively and to exclude, in a way that excludes people. I think it's going to be litigated forever. In my opinion, most women who are subject to domestic abuse in Central America, for example, cannot count on the protection of their governments, either for lack of capacity or lack of will. And either one of those, in my view, should entitle people to refugee protection.
Be restructured, you said? Yeah?
No, I don't think so. I think social group is sufficiently expansive that it can cover those cases.
Hello, good afternoon. Happy International Women's Day. I'm Sarah. I'm a junior here at Tufts University. I'm curious to know more about what efforts can be done to secure the trajectory of women migrants, especially from Central America coming into Mexico and the U.S. through caravans. Like, what can be done to secure these trajectories, and also like what has been done to minimize their risk in the process? Thank you.
Well, we, as IAM, we've been working closely with governments. We have strengthened capacities with the consular network to identify the profile of possible human trafficking victims. But as was said in the last panel, it depends also on the countries. For example, the transit countries, they must have the will to assist these victims. For example, in the country of origins, as I mentioned, there are several laws related to minimize the gender-based violence, and that have been applied. But one way or another, women still want to leave the country. So that's why the transit country and also the host country, the country of destination, as we call in IAM, they need to apply their laws also. But as from IAM, we've been working, as I mentioned, in the strengthened capacities of the governments in, for example, the consular networks to identify the profiles. We also have been working in creative programs to empower women in the country of origin so they don't see the migration as the only option for development. If they migrate, that they can do it just because they want an option among other options of development, but not only the option. That is what we've been doing, and I know it's not enough, but we hope it can be stopped sooner or later.
Can I add? Yeah, go ahead.
A couple of practical things. Some NGOs have, I mean, it's more cynical, but and it's not pertaining to Latin America, but it can be transferred to trajectories of women. But they were giving out along the routes, they were giving out birth control. Really horrible fact, but that's the reality as well. And but other governments have also started to say, well, we need to train also our border guards to be able to figure out, is there a person or a woman that has been traumatized, a victim of trafficking, because it's really difficult sometimes to tell, and to figure this out and to become much more sensitive to that. Of course, you have to have border guards that are willing to do that, but at least they are. But it's also a crucial part of what you have in your policy portfolio.
Yes, I'm glad Astrid mentioned the protections and attempts to detect victims of trafficking, but I think there's really a much larger question about how control mechanisms look at and respond to women migrants, and especially women who are seeking asylum or attempting or are entering without prior authorization. As I'm sure you know, the people who are crossing the southern border now are such a different group than our, in the United States, than our Customs and Border Patrol have been accustomed to dealing with and have been trained to deal with. Prior to 2005, not so long ago, 90% of the apprehensions along the border of people crossing irregularly were male. 90%. Almost all of them, about 90%, were Mexican. So now, in the first few months of this fiscal year, 2019, 67% have been people traveling in family groups or unaccompanied children. ICE has no idea how to deal with these people. It is such a different, for one thing, they're not trying to evade border controls. They are crossing the border and handing themselves over to border controls. And our system is just not equipped to deal with them. So the first answer is detention. We don't have anywhere near enough detention spaces and beds that are appropriate for family groups and children. The system of immigration courts to deal with their asylum cases is also woefully inadequate. So people are now waiting 2 or 3 years for an asylum hearing. In the meantime, our laws fortunately prevent the system from holding particularly children for that long. So they have to be released into the community. So it's just a completely different setup that our system was not designed to deal with. And it has not only the uncertainty and sort of chaos among people in this caseload, but it also creates a moral hazard because people know that the system can't deal with family groups. And, I'm sorry to say, I think that does make people more likely to come in family groups and to bring their children and expose them to these risks. So I think that's a sort of tough reality that we also have to face. And so I guess, my answer is that we're nowhere near to being able to answer and to deal with the question that you asked, but it's a very important one.
Thank you.
So first things first, happy International Women's Day to all ladies here. And secondly, before I ask my question, I'd like to say that I am a very firm supporter of equalness between men and women because my question is going to be a bit controversial. So what I wanted to ask, of course, also regarding migrants and regarding women as a community as a whole, is that I'd first like to raise an example in my home country, China. I'm from Beijing Peck University. My name is Lu Jianzhang. And so there's a debate that in China, sometimes corporations, they ask their female employees to sign a contract that's like, you cannot be pregnant within a certain time period. This is, of course, a violation of human rights and the violation of the Chinese constitution and relevant laws, but this is often done on a massive scale in my country. The reason behind this is that if women, after they get employed, immediately gets maternity leave, then that is considered as a big loss of profit for these firms in general, and in a very competitive commercial environment such as China, this is sometimes deemed as unredeemable. So what I would like to ask is that there has been an opinion that means like in order to ensure this equalness, this fairness between men and women, governments either have to direct fiscal resources into allowances such as to make these enterprises actually get a refund from the government for respecting women's rights or in some other manner. And therefore they have came to the conclusion that women's right itself, while something respectable at least, is actually burdensome and costly. So I would just like to know what you think about this opinion, and do you believe is there any way to help change this kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I think, yes, you rightfully mentioned it's a human right to, and choice to decide when you have children, and this should be no matter whether you're a father or a mother or to be. And of course the argument you're making with the companies, I mean, companies, of course, they want to have, I get it, they want to have employers that they can count on, as you mentioned, but on the other hand, you also, as a country, need to ensure your demographic factor, and as far as I know, China is having quite some trouble with that. And as far as I know, it's really challenging to have children and family and work life together. So as far as I know, I think it would be better for employers to really think how you can start to rethink this. And I mean, coming from Germany, of course, where you have, yes, it sounds like heaven for others, but you have a long time of maternity leave, but also father's leave. It's from Sweden. And I think we need to get to a time where employers are not sure whether the father or the mother will take the time off. Or who will take the time. And of course I get the economic argument, but I'm not in favor of giving any offsets to that, because it's also in the interest of an economy to actually, if you want to keep it in the economic terms, to have enough people to work and to be employed, and hence should have an interest in offspring. So that's my answer.
That it's a fundamental element of corporate social responsibility, you know, to be good citizens of the country in which they operate, whether that's their home country or abroad. And nothing is more fundamental to that than reproductive rights. Companies may not know who's going to take the parental leave, but they can be pretty sure it's the women who are going to have the babies. So I think there is an issue that companies just have to understand that it's part of their responsibility as corporate citizens to have policies that facilitate parenthood and reduce the stress of trying to balance work-life balance. That's sort of the goal that I think every government and every corporation should be working toward.
I think that governments their main goal is to protect human rights for their population. So private sector is a key factor to protect these human rights. And I totally agree with you. They have to protect the women's rights for maternity.
One footnote, sorry. But we also know that women who are coming back from maternity leave, even if they work part-time, the productivity is quite increased. And I don't need to talk to the mothers in the room or the fathers who are doing this, working part-time. You're actually much more productive because you have to organize yourself much more than when you, instead of you have time, you can take breaks, you go out and talk. And so maybe, the economists among you can also figure out if there's an equation to make on that one, and maybe people should be paid back.
So much. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Oriane. I'm part of the French delegation, and I have a question for you, Ms. Debord. I wanted to know why exactly women are more inclined to make peace agreements, and they're more likely to last, because I feel like it reinforces the gender stereotype, like the fact that women are more gentle, consensual. So yeah, I wanted to know why exactly, if you have the answer.
It's a good question, and of course you can wonder yourself, well, do you really want to foster or to reinforce gender stereotypes? But you have to also look into what the numbers were giving out at this point in time. And I think and this is where I appeal to the sociologist, because trying to think this through myself, because I don't think that it's necessarily that men are more belligerent or that women are trying harder. I don't know, you also have a lot of men who are doing this, so I fully agree with you. But when I tried to think of it, why is that? It's that probably if you actually get to a point where women can be part of a peace process, means that you've already had to have a different societal discussion or conversations that actually enables that. So that is what I think might be a factor that we have to think through. why this is the case and not fall into gender stereotypes. But then again, I think women, okay, that's tricky, but there is a collaborative, more collaborative effort in peace conversations that is also attested, and trying to find common agreements. I'm not saying that this is not the case that for men are doing this as well, but this is what the studies have shown so far.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments today. My name is Madison. I'm a first year's master's candidate at the Fletcher School studying migration and development economics. I wanted to pose two quick questions. The first is, to what extent do you believe the Global Compact internalized gender, and do you believe it was sufficient? And the second question is, as we know, most migrants and refugees are living outside of camps, especially in urban areas, and often in countries that are underdeveloped or have conflicts of their own, like Jordan or Egypt or Turkey. In this context, we'll see men and women alike migrating from a situation of vulnerability potentially into a situation of short-term additional vulnerability. What types of programming and initiatives from a humanitarian perspective would you suggest as approaching this unique problem in kind of a long-term protracted situation?
Sure, I can, let me talk about the compact first. I think for those of you who haven't followed this, in December of last year, the overwhelming majority of members of the United Nations adopted what's called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And this is the first internationally negotiated document about migration, international migration, that has ever been adopted in the United Nations system, the first comprehensive document. And it starts off with a list of sort of fundamental principles underlying the compact. And one of them is that the compact will be gender responsive. And I think it's a pretty good statement. It's not long. If you don't mind, I'll just read it to you. It says, the Global Compact ensures that the human rights of women, men, girls, and boys are respected at all stages of migration. Their specific needs are properly understood and addressed, and they are empowered as agents of change. It mainstreams a gender perspective, promotes gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, recognizing their independence, agency, and leadership in order to move away from addressing migrant women primarily through a lens of victimhood. I think that's a pretty good statement. I would say that it leaves out any sort of unconventional gender identities. That would be one criticism. But I think apart from that, it's a pretty good statement of principle surrounding gender. And throughout most of the 23 objectives of the compact, you have references back to that principle of being gender sensitive. So, the proof of the compact will be in how governments implement it and whether they carry through on that sensitivity to gender dimensions. But as far as the document itself goes, I think it's pretty good. For refugees outside of camps, which are the vast majority of refugees, I think really the critical thing, the key to their dignity and well-being is livelihoods. There have been various forms of experimentation with that. There's some very good examples in Uganda, for example, which I'm sure you're familiar with, giving refugees access to land so that they can support themselves. We've seen the sort of compact in Jordan between private sector employers, refugees, and the government that's supposed to give access to jobs in economic free zones to refugees. It's not working very well, but it's a framework that could be improved upon, I think, in other settings. So I think we're in a period of a lot of experimentation around how to provide a more dignified and sort of satisfactory life for refugees outside of camps. And I think, it's really, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard for me to say really nice things about Turkey these days with the tendency toward authoritarianism in that country, but they're doing a great job with Syrian refugees. I mean, they have, they're only 6 or 7% of the refugees are in camps. These are 5-star camps. UNHCR has criticized them for being too lavish, but people still don't want to live in them because they say they're like 5-star prisons, you know. But they have started the process of opening work permits for refugees. They're very tolerant of work outside the formal labor market, which is, after all, where most of the jobs in the very short term are going to be created. They give refugees access to healthcare and education on the same terms as Turks, and are trying to actually mainstream them into the Turkish education system rather than having separate Arab language schools. So, you know, there's a lot going on around these issues of how to deal with these enormous populations, and some countries are doing better jobs than others.
I just would like to add that the Global Compact, the way it was created, it was comprehensive, it was consulted all the countries with several actors, institutions, the academy. However, we need to take into account that this Global Compact doesn't force the governments. It is voluntary for them to accomplish what is in it. And related to the refugees out of the camps, I just would like to add the mental health and psychological assistance. All the process they have followed, it is necessary to give them the mental health and psychological assistance because they are facing a new world. They are facing totally new a language, country, culture. So it is essential for them to have assistance in this area.
Hello, my name is Rocío Maciel. I'm actually also a student from the Fletcher School. Thank you very much for your comments. And I have a question, I guess, for Ms. Newland, but not sure. It's a little bit following up the first question regarding the refugees and kind of how difficult it is to apply for women or actually for men that are fleeing violence in the Northern Triangle. And I know one of the arguments against kind of enhancing the definition is that it's better to have this one than nothing, because in this current climate, probably if we try to enhance it and include more categories, it's probably not gonna work that way. So I was just wondering, considering that, do you think there's any chance that it can actually be transformed, if you will, like if we can have a better and more comprehensive or inclusive definition without losing what we already have? Thanks.
That's a great question. I think in formal terms, the answer is no. It would not be a good idea to reopen the convention for the reason that you suggested, that the definitions could be, and protections could be watered down rather than strengthened. And I think that's one of the reasons that the process we've just been through of UNHCR devising a refugee compact distinct from the migration compact was very much focused on implementation, not on expanding or opening refugee law, but just extending the kind of assistance, and particularly the assistance to host countries, so that refugees will be more welcome and more easily accommodated. But in terms of, you know, how can the convention accommodate broader definitions, whether it's under the social group category and interpretations of that? The answer is definitely yes, yes, yes. I mean, you look at the population of refugees who are given formal refugee status today in most countries, they are not covered by the convention. They are refugees from war. And war refugees are not mentioned in the Refugee Convention. They are not people who are being personally persecuted because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of the social group. They are people who are trying to get out of the way of the guns and the broad human rights violations and events disturbing public order, which have been incorporated in other instruments, like the African Union has a refugee convention, Central and South American countries agreed upon something called, I'm sure you're familiar with, the Cartagena Declaration, which doesn't have the status of a treaty, but includes these broader categories. So countries can protect whomever they want to protect. And most, just by small c convention, war refugees have been accepted as refugees, even if they have, very little nexus with the convention definitions.
Hello, I'm Danny Yang. I'm from Peking University of China. Actually, my major is international politics, and my focus is East Asia study. So I'm going to write my graduate thesis on Abenomics, Womenomics in Japan. And what I want to ask is that, as we know, Abe government wants to encourage more women to work to deal with the problem of aging problem and the shortage of labor. But maybe in the long time, if more women to go to work, the time for them to get married and give birth to babies will also be delayed. So that will be the problem, that although in short time, like the economics or the labor problem might be solved by those housewives to go out. But what the job they do is just like part-time jobs and very short-time jobs, so they cannot get the same salary with men. But in the long time, this is bad for the whole country's birth rate. And this is the first question. And the second point I want to raise is that if looking into the data of China's women's involvement of working, it's very interesting that in 1990s, the over 95% of women work at that time. So it's a pretty high, very high number. But these years, the number is declining, but it is still like around 90%. So it's almost the top high rate of working of women. What I want to ask is that although the working rate is pretty high, it's very high, but there are still some discrimination for women, especially because I'm going to graduate, so I just face the process of finding a job. And when I get interviewed, I will be asked as, do you have a boyfriend, or do you have any plan to get married, or if some works I need to go abroad, they will ask, oh, so what's your opinion of your boyfriend if you go abroad? So, and recently the government just have a law to ask company to, the companies are not allowed to ask those questions. But maybe the government has a good idea just to prevent such kind of discrimination, but I'm still afraid that maybe the companies will just not hire women rather than ask those questions. And some companies will just say, oh, we are equal to both men or women, but maybe I will apply for that, but maybe in the last round I will not get a job just because I'm a girl. So how to solve such kind of things? Thank you.
Okay. So you asked about the Womenomics in Japan. That was your first question, and that's something that I understand you're looking into as your thesis. So if I understood correctly, you are wondering if in the short term, I mean, there's a short-term gain to bring women into the labor market, or could you specify your question again on that one?
Short term, like women can go to work and make the labor market to be fulfilled. But in the long term, this might decline or decrease the birth rate.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that you can see in in other countries as well. I mean, in Germany, the birth rate of women with a first baby is relatively late now. These days, I think it's around 31 or something, so rather late. And this is why you have a lot of, and also in the US, I mean, a lot of companies are now trying to figure out how then, because on the one hand, you're interested to get women into the labor market, on the other hand, you're interested to have babies as an economy and as a country. This is where all the questions about, as we mentioned before, how do you combine work-life balance, but also, to name it, I mean, this is where these practices of social freezing come in, where companies actually are paying for that. That's a whole nother story. And at the same time, you also, I mean, of course, I know Japan is a special case, where you could have more increased migration as well. I know it's not popular, but that could be another way to offset some of the labor shortages, but it's not really a welcomed, or let's put it that way, not really much practiced policy, but that could be another option as well. But by and large, I would say, well, that's also a question. I mean, Germany has been struggling with that. We're right, with you in Japan, more or less, with that for a long, long time. How do we get people to, have families, but at the same time enable women to participate in the labor force? We have the highest number of women working part-time in Europe. And some are saying, well, this is bad. Others are saying, no, this actually allows for a very flexible model to combine that. If you're a migrant woman, it's especially hard. You're seen as doubly or triply discriminated because A, you're a woman, B, you have struggles actually finding a job and keeping the job then. But then also to combine the family life, etc., is really hard. In Germany, we haven't really found a good solution at this point. This is why we have introduced this more lenient family leave policy. But when you talk to employers like Siemens, they say they have 265 models of part-time employment in their own one factory or one company in one part of Germany. And you think it's crazy, but on the other hand, I think this is a future where we need to figure out how can you get to flexible models so that it is possible to combine it more easily?
Add that the countries that are facing the biggest problems with the demographic deficit, with very low birth rates, Italy, Spain, Japan, Germany, Hungary, Russia, most of the former Soviet Union, in fact, very low birth rates. And these are all countries in which there has been a failure to accommodate or to achieve either gender balance, preferably in combination with public arrangements for work-life balance. And as long as the burden falls on women, I mean, there's this Greek Greek comedy of Lysistrata, where the women go on a sex strike for better treatment. Well, there is, in effect, a birth strike in these countries because I lived in Japan for 5 years, and, for women, the society just does not accommodate mothers and professionals, except in very exceptional cases. And I think as long as societies fail to do that, if they put all the burden of reproductive labor on women, that they're going to have this problem if women have the capacity and the power to control their fertility. And the countries that have succeeded in this, in maintaining birth rates while having high rates of women in the labor force and high quality of life, for everyone, have invested heavily in child care, publicly subsidized or financed child care, encouraged equal parenting responsibilities among women and men with things like, requiring men to take part of parental leave. The Nordics, France actually has managed to maintain its birth rate in Europe and has a very extensive program of family subsidies. And so I think this is, this is something that countries like Japan and China quite soon, perhaps already, are really going to have to face if they don't make it possible for women to fulfill their potential both reproductively and professionally. They are going to run into these kinds of problems, and I hope that realization will cause more governments to look to the Nordic models and so on. Raising healthy families and having a healthy labor force is a goal and is a good for the whole society, and the whole society needs to invest in that, in my opinion.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I once worked for an NGO in China which targets to help women refugees from Syria to live better in Turkey. And we try to encourage them to do some earrings, handcrafts, and help them to sell them in China. But it's really upset because sometimes it looks like they are just be inspired, they are be helped, and they are not doing that spontaneously. So my question is, what is the real meaning of women empowerment? And more importantly, how? Thank you.
Sort of small, specific questions that we can answer easily. I think the answer to that begins with asking women what they want, and really engaging in a dialogue with what it is that they need and want, and trying to work that into programs of public policy. I'm involved with a similar project for Syrian refugees in Turkey, but we started out sort of surveying the skills and interests of women and men, and building a program around culinary training and skills, helping women, who knew how to cook really well, if you've ever been to Syria, and helping them to develop livelihoods in restaurant catering and other kind of food production. So these things can't be successful if they're top down. I think the meaning of empowerment is to find ways for women to express their own needs and try to accommodate them, rather than deciding what their needs will be and bringing it from the top down. That's kind of the best answer I can think of on short term.
They just don't know what they want. So sometimes we just teach what we want them to know.
You can think about, there's something called Singa. I don't know if you're familiar with them. So it's an NGO, and it's a business incubator, and they're purposefully saying we don't call the refugees who are coming from Syria, we're calling them refugees, but for us they're the entrepreneurs, or they're people who want to build up something. They don't know yet what this will be, but we encourage them, or they encourage them to think outside the box. And of course, you first when you come, you have to first get situated. I mean, it's quite stressful to figure out what you want when you're in your own country. Imagine you've had such a trajectory, and then to figure out, well, what is it that I want? And you might not know the language, you're not used to anything. But to really then have also other networks of civil society, of businesses who say, okay, look, we can offer internships. And for women or for others to test out what their skills are is quite important. And of course, you need role models as well, and this can be also from the other migrant community. So there's in Germany, for example, there's migrant women who are called they're integration sisters in a way, and they're helping because they sometimes come from the same cultural background or they speak the language. They can try and help them aid to navigate and get situated in the new situation. Because you can only have ideas when you feel you're somewhat situated, and then they work with them, and so this has actually worked quite well, and I think those are the models that could be employed more.
The problem is not so much that women don't know what they want, as that they don't know what the possibilities are. And I think the Singa model is one that helps people understand what possibilities are out there, and then they can find their way to their own preferences.
A little back to the mental health and psychological assistance, because sometimes they express they don't know what they want, but as she says, they really know. But we have to guide them a little bit on what are the options that they may have, because we had an experience in El Salvador from a women returnee. She wanted to settle a bakery, but she had never baked. She doesn't know how to have a business, and we guided her a little bit, and she finally started another business, but maybe they need the psychological assistance and entrepreneurs assistance to guide them how to make the process of reintegration.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming in today. It's really incredible to be in a room that's really establishing that, you know, immigrants' rights are women's rights and women's rights are immigrants' rights. I think that's really beautiful. My name's Amira. I'm a senior. I major in international relations, and I'm also do a lot of student organizing in the immigrants' rights movement. So we've talked a lot about policy, and I'm wondering if we can kind of shift that conversation and talk more about like people's movements. So my question is two parts. One, if any of you can share any insights about what you think, you know, given the separation of families, given the rampant sexual and physical assault and emotional abuse of migrants in detention centers, what you think of the Abolish ICE movement in the US, and also if you could speak, not to be totally US centric, about, you know, other movements around the world for immigrant justice.
Well, since your question is U.S. focused, I'll start off. I don't think the Abolish ICE movement is, it's not where I would start with the quest for immigrant justice. I think, you know, reform ICE, make ICE behave in a way that's in the interests of the United States. And I believe that it is in the interest of the United States to treat immigrants properly and to make sure that their rights are enforced and observed and lifted up. I think, you know, that is part of their job, but I think it is also part of their job to control our borders. And I'm not an open borders advocate. I think borders serve a function. And at their best, they become zones of interaction, as they are in many border cities until you put a wall up through them. I think to me, the people's movements and the immigrants' rights movements that I really admire are those that are doing two things at once, that are addressing real problems of practical problems of real people. Things like the Centro de los Derechos de Migrantes, which works with migrants whose labor rights have been violated and tries to not only get justice for them, but also to get compensation. If they haven't been paid, if they've been injured and haven't been compensated. So I think, you know, the people's movements are critical. I mean, this is really where the energy for justice starts. But I think that our institutions and my approach to our institutions and laws is to sort of reform them and make them work better rather than to abolish them. And I think the Abolish ICE movement is sort of alienates a lot of people who interpret that as meaning that advocates for that don't have a respect for our institutions and rule of law. That's my concern. So straight answer.
Okay, thank you.
Just one footnote to that. I mean, there are, of course, lots of organizations who are struggling to make ends meet, to defend and to figure out how to bring justice or to make sure that migrants have a good defendant and are represented. But they're always underfunded. It's always a constant challenge. We know that in the struggle. And I mean, this is not just in the US, it's also all over the place. And currently the challenge, or what some, and sorry, bringing it back a little bit to policy, is trying to figure out how can you create an asylum system where the access, or where you can have someone, or a right to a hearing and a lawyer from the very beginning. At least in Germany, that's not necessarily the case, because your asylum case is first reviewed by the institutions, etc. And there are models, like in Switzerland, who have tested it. It's not without, we don't know how well it will play out, but where they have tested it so that you have, and they've worked with the Refugee and Asylum Council, so it's an NGO in a way, which then received criticism for engaging with the government on this. So I'm sorry, it's also very tricky because you can't make it right in a way. But they were saying, well, we want to be able to, from the very beginning, to have migrants, to have a lawyer, and so that the process actually of the asylum case itself can be shortened, because everyone can hear everything from the very beginning. They said it led to fairer processes. I don't know. I mean, you can also argue that shorter doesn't mean fairer. I fully get that, but it means that they were less inclined to go against the I don't know what you call it in legal terms, the verdict or of the hearing later on. So there is a case to bring in to merge that the people's movement or asylum lawyers right into the process. And so this is currently something that where you see some debates, at least, also in Germany on that.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Chloe from France. Thank you for all these inspiring perspectives, especially today. We've mentioned feminist foreign policies, especially in Sweden. And don't you think that while promoting gender equality abroad could be a great thing, it would also be a little bit hypocritical if we continue trading with the countries that are not respecting women's rights or LGBT rights. And also another thought on that would be, isn't it a way for Western societies to keep on giving lessons to other societies, especially underdeveloped countries, without taking into account the particularities of these areas regarding like religion, social features of these societies?
Very good and a very difficult question. And I remember, this will give you some sense of really how old I am. I went to the first International Women's Conference in Mexico City in 1975. And there was a big U.S. delegation with, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and all the great sort of second wave of American feminism leaders. And I just remember the complete shock to the American delegation system when they were confronted with women from particularly the Islamic world. The Iranian delegation was very outspoken, saying, your idea of liberation is not our idea of liberation. We appreciate being liberated from being defined by the male gaze and being, slaves to fashion and so on and so forth. And that certainly, it was a shock, and it taught me a lesson about exactly what you're talking about. But, I think each of us has to define our bottom lines in terms of values. And my bottom line is that I think women should be able to make choices about how they live their lives. I don't imagine for a minute that that's easy. When you value being a part of family life and your family is part of a culture in which women are subordinate to that sets up an extremely difficult choice. So I think it's important to avoid sort of moral imperialism, but at the same time, my bottom line value is I think women should have the choice of how they live.
Underscore this because at the end we're human beings, and human beings should have choices. No matter where you live in the world, no matter what society it is, and so this is where for me is the bottom line. And I don't think in gender in these terms. Then I see power play, but I want to see human beings who have the choice to make their own choices and to have equal access to what they want to have equal access to. And if this is not guaranteed, then it's a challenge. And you asked the question, well, should we not be so hypocritical and actually not engage in the countries where we know that they're not treating or not adhering to these standards, if I understood correctly? So we used to have a former minister who was openly gay, and he said, well, I'm not going to engage in any country where I know that the rights of gays are not treated or respected. And then you think there, which you wouldn't even be able to be foreign minister of Germany, because you also have areas where this is not the case. But on the other hand, we also not only have an obligation to the governments of these countries, but to the people in these countries. And this is why, of course, you keep doing work, because you work with civil society. You don't just work with the government. You work on subnational leadership. You work, and this is also what the groups are telling or saying. We need to know that we're not alone in the world. And if you keep pulling out, if you're leaving, then this is really horrible. And the U.S. was actually quite adamant, former times, to really promote also diversity in some of the countries where, in Eastern Europe, and the people were always coming back and telling us it's so helpful because no one else is pushing this agenda, and we're really thankful for that. So I see the point about moral imperialism, but I think at the end we want to give the rights to human beings, no matter what gender they have.
I also think that women must have their own choices, being able to take decisions and being economic independent. That is the main point, because we don't have to depend on men to have our own decisions. And also what developed countries are making is funding programs that are focused, empowering women. For example, Canada this year has designated funds to programs focused on that. I think that is a good way to address the topic.
Unfortunately, in the interest of time, I'm going to, since we do have a panel after this, but I'm sure that y'all would be willing
Sounds
to
good.
field more. So.
Hello, my name is Ines. I'm with the French delegation. I feel like since the beginning of those discussions, one of the main focuses has been how to integrate women and migrant women to the economy, how to, make sure that they can contribute to a prosper, productive economy. Don't you think that analyzing the question of gender equality from the perspective of economic profit and the integration of women into the market economy is itself a mistake, since the capitalist functioning is itself the framework that conveys a lot of inequalities? And since, don't you think that maybe we should stop thinking about how to make women, put them in the mold of economic profit and stuff, because in the end, capitalism and patriarchy reinforce each other anyway?
And we can then answer your question, but wondering what your...
Don't worry. My question is basically, don't you think that maybe...
Question. I'm
Okay.
just asking back. And I think you have a valid point. But what's your alternative that you're seeing? Capital. We can have a huge debate about.
My alternative would be to put into question the whole functioning of our economy and try to put into question our whole structure, rather than trying to make people thrive through it. Just put into question the whole perspective that we have on it. So change our economy, basically.
There's capitalism and capitalism. I think the what we might call the Swedish model of sort of controlled capitalism, where there are very high rates of tax and very robust programs of social support. It's a functionally much more egalitarian society than the libertarian, the small L liberal economy that we have in the United States, which fosters such high rates of inequality and low provision of social safety net. So I am in favor of the former and think we should reform the latter. And I think whatever direction that's moving in, that women should be an equal part of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm still thinking, but the question is, of course, how, of course, to say I'm questioning this model is, of course, it's a valid point, and you should question always models, and you should figure out, well, what is this? Is this the most ideal system that we can have, or what's the better one, or is it just choosing from some bad models, or? And of course, there are shortcomings with capitalist societies. We all know that, we're aware of that. The question is, what is your alternative, and how do you get there, and how does that guarantee that you can have the rights and access to what you want to have? But I think this is somewhere we can have a discussion later on, but would look forward to that.
Okay, hi, I'm Haita from Brazil. Okay, we're talking about migration and integration and economic independence, but actually our perception and what we know about migration is mainly from a male perspective, from male stories, because we can really access women's stories from migration. We don't have access to women regarding that topic. So how can the state, the society, on a local or global level, how can we access the stories from women? For example, I say that because our perception of war, for example, is a male perception. Nevertheless, we had a lot of women fighting battles. We only know the male stories. So how can we access the women to actually know their needs? Because we say a lot of things from our perception or idea of what integration would be, but how can a woman who doesn't leave her home integrate in a society? She doesn't speak the language. Sometimes the husband doesn't even allow her to get out of home. So how can we access that real women struggling with that?
Just one thing or one example that comes into my mind is, so we know that one main or fact for integration that you need to have, or skills, is to have the language skills. And for that, you need to have access to a language class, etc. And for some women, it has been really hard because the men wouldn't want them to go and learn the language and be smarter in their sense than themselves. And so what some NGOs and others have come up with, we're saying, well, okay, we're combining some skills, traditional skills, which the men wouldn't feel threatened by. I'm just putting it very, obviously very bluntly in that sense, but so they were having cooking classes or sewing classes, and we're combining it with language classes. So that was a way to accommodate some of the situations that they were encountering, because of course you can say, oh, that's horrible, you need to come and learn the language, but this was an offer where both could say, keep their face, so to speak, but still you would get to the women and help them get the language access that they would need. So that's just one example of how to do it, or how to think.
Okay, just to add a little bit, but those are private NGO initiatives, and I was thinking if the government or society in a whole could do something.
Well, I'm going to explain about my experience in the region, Northern Triangle. For example, to have the information from the needs of women, what we are is capturing the information when they return home. But we have only the information for returning women. And for example, we have two types of migration: the regular migration that is totally different, and the irregular migration. The irregular migration governments in the Northern Triangle are making efforts, for example, in Guatemala, that they speak Spanish, but also the native language, to teach both native and Spanish so they can reintegrate in the society. That is an approach that I think can be implemented to have in certain programs to learn the language.
I think there's been really a lot of progress. As I said, I've been working on this stuff for 40 years, and maybe even a little bit more. And I think there is a huge difference now in the extent to which women's voices are listened to, that there are efforts to create sort of safe spaces for women to express themselves, which is often, very important if women don't feel comfortable in certain cultures of getting up and asking a question in a public place or telling their stories or that kind of thing. So, but I do think there has been progress, and there just needs to be a lot more. How? Listen. You need to not just passively listen, but really make a point of going to women and listening and asking them respectfully to let you know what's going on. And it's, I've been on, boards of a lot of big humanitarian NGOs and so on, and I think they really have learned a lot about doing that in the last couple of decades. And I think, that your question is a very good one, that we just need to continue to make those efforts to be sure that women are heard.
So, okay. Many women migrate with their children very little. And when these women arrive in the new country, they have to face a struggle of having their kids raised in a different culture. So my question is, how can these women manage their process better, and what the role of the country, the host country, in that process?
That's a great question. Most of my exposure to this sort of question has been through the refugee resettlement program in this country, and it is, it's often a really heartbreaking thing to see, children, often very young children, who have this responsibility of being the interpreters for their family, of being a cultural bridge, of trying to navigate the world of the home and the world of the school and other institutions outside of the home. And, they're incredibly resilient and often really good at it. But it does place a real burden on them. And I think that the approach that's probably going to be most successful is providing more support to the mothers. And it's something that, I think a lot of organizations, both immigrant integration organizations and humanitarian organizations, try to do, but it's quite resource intensive, especially adult education. English language education is really inadequate in this country. So the children do end up being put in this position of being the interpreters. But I think both sort of cultural and linguistic and support for the mothers is important. And programs like the one that Astrid mentioned, Singa, which started in France, which tries to connect newcomers with local residents for the benefit of both. Says, we're not a humanitarian organization. We're not trying to help refugees. We're trying to help our society and all the people who live in it live together and benefit from each other's presence. And so I think, opening up to try to reach women who often, as one of your previous questioners said, who often are isolated in their homes, is a really important aspect of immigrant and refugee integration. So thanks for your question.
I only want to straight out something. I see an opportunity for diaspora here, for the communities. They can strengthen their capacities and the communities. The ones that already are in the country, they can assist the ones that are arriving. This has happened in some countries, and I think diaspora is a key actor in this.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ms. Newland, Ms. Siebart, and Ms. Mata for your thoughtful and inclusive responses. And thank you all for your very insightful questions. Have a wonderful rest of your International Women's Day. And the next panel, Defining Refugees in a Changing Climate, is going to take place immediately.